There are things a man can sell and things he cannot. Reed Calloway had learned the difference the hard way over the course of 14 months that had taken everything from him except the two most important reasons he was still breathing and the thin gold band he kept folded inside a piece of tissue paper behind his driver's license. The tools had gone first. His snap-on socket set the one he had built piece by piece over 15 years of working construction sites from Memphis to Knoxville. Then the table saw his father-in-law had given him the Christmas before Mara got sick. Then the levels, the squares, the chalk lines, the things that had made him not just a worker, but a craftsman, a man who could look at raw lumber and empty ground and see something finished and true in his mind before a single nail was driven. He had sold them all to a pawn shop on Highway 70, standing at the counter, while the owner made low sounds and offered lower numbers. And Reed had accepted every offer without argument, because argument required energy he no longer had. The house in Clarksville had gone next, not sold, taken. The bank had been patient the way institutions are patient when the outcome is already decided, sending letters in envelopes with small windows that Reed had stopped opening toward the end. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday in March, 30 days to vacate, and Reed stood in the kitchen where Mara had taught Lily to make biscuits, and where Finn had taped his first engineering diagram to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like the 50 states, and he felt the floor of himself give way in a manner that had nothing to do with the house. Mara had been gone for 3 years by then, 38 months to be precise, though Reed had stopped counting at some point because counting felt like a kind of accounting he could not afford. Ovarian cancer diagnosed 14 months after the twins were born, managed for 6 years with a combination of treatment and stubbornness, and the particular ferocity that Mara Calloway had brought to everything she decided mattered. She had decided that her children mattered more than anything on earth, and so she had fought with everything medicine could offer and everything she could manufacture from sheer will. And she had bought them 6 years before the disease finally collected what it was owed. The medical bills had outlasted her by a considerable margin. Insurance had covered portions. Reed had covered the rest with savings, then with credit, then with the equity in the house, and finally with the tools of his trade, dismantling his professional identity piece by piece to pay for the years he had been given with a woman who deserved more years than the universe had seen fit to provide. He had been a foreman for Hargrove Construction for 11 years when Mara's treatments entered their final phase. He had taken leave, first formal and then informal, because there was no version of himself that could stand on a job site calculating load-bearing specifications. While his wife was losing weight, she could not afford to lose in a hospital bed 40 minutes away. Hargrove had been understanding until temporary extended past the point of reasonable accommodation. The termination came in a letter professional and regretful in tone, the kind that HR departments produce when they need to end something without accepting responsibility for ending it. By the time Reed loaded the twins and everything that remained of their lives into the 1987 Winnebago he had purchased from a salvage yard for $3,000, and a handshake he had $347 in a checking account, and a vehicle that a more honest seller would have described as optimistic rather than operational. The RV ran. That was the most truthful thing Reed could say about it. It ran the way very old, very tired things run, with complaint and hesitation, and the constant mechanical suggestion that today might be the day it decided to stop. They had not planned to stop in Millhaven. Millhaven, Tennessee had not been on any list Reed had made because Reed had stopped making lists around the same time he had stopped opening envelopes. The town appeared in the windshield on a Thursday afternoon in March, nestled in a valley between hills that were just beginning to consider the possibility of spring green in the RV's transmission, chose that moment to express its final opinion on the subject of forward motion. There was a sound like a large animal clearing its throat, a shudder that ran through the entire vehicle from axle to ceiling panel, and then a progressive slowing that Reed recognized immediately as not the kind of slowing you recover from. He managed to coast the RV onto a gravel shoulder at the edge of an abandoned lot on the eastern outskirts of town before the transmission completed its resignation. The lot sat at the intersection of Millhaven Road and what a faded sign identified as Sycamore Branch Way, though the branch itself had been culverted over at some point in the town's history and the way led nowhere in particular. Tall grass had reclaimed most of the lot. Wild chicory grew in dense patches near the road, its flowers, the particular blue that Mara had always called impossible, because no manufactured color ever quite matched it. A rusted for sale sign leaned at an angle near the entrance, its phone number weathered past legibility. Reed sat in the driver's seat for a long moment after the engine died, his hands still on the wheel in the way that hands sometimes stay on a thing after the thing has stopped requiring them. Behind him in the narrow bunk area, he had configured from the dining booth, and two pieces of plywood, Lily and Finn were doing what they had learned to do during the long, uncertain months of their transit through various parking lots and campgrounds and overnight rest stops. They were being quiet. Not the quiet of children who have nothing to say, but the quiet of children who have learned to read the atmosphere around their father and respond accordingly. Lily broke it first because Lily always broke it first. She was the one who had inherited Mara's particular understanding that silence left too long became its own kind of damage. "Are we stopping here, Daddy?" "For tonight," Reed said, which was what he said when he did not know the answer. Finn appeared at his shoulder with the composition notebook that served as his engineering log, already open to a page where he had been recording the RV's mechanical symptoms for the past 200 miles. Reed could see the careful handwriting, the diagrams, the notations about sound frequency and vibration patterns. Finn had decided at some point in the wordless way that children decide things that if he documented the problems precisely enough, a solution would become apparent. It was a reasonable hypothesis. It was also, in this case, optimistic. "Transmission," Finn said. The way he said it was not a question. "Transmission," Reed confirmed. Finn wrote something in his notebook. Reed did not look to see what. They ate that evening from cans that Reed heated on the small propane stove, and afterward the twins did what they always did in the hour before sleep. Lily opened the purple-covered journal that she kept on a nail above her bunk, the one with the unicorn sticker on the front that had begun to peel at one corner, and she drew. She had been drawing the same house for months in the way that some people return obsessively to a piece of music that contains something they cannot quite reach. Each version was slightly different, slightly more detailed, rooms added and refined and annotated in her careful 10-year-old cursive. A reading corner with a window seat, a workshop for Daddy, a garden with specific flowers named, the kitchen where the light came in from the east so the mornings were gold. Finn sat across from her and worked on what he called the systems assessment, his ongoing documentation of everything in the RV that was not functioning as designed, and his proposed interventions for each failure. The list had grown considerably over the past month. Reed, sitting in the driver's seat that led nowhere, listened to the scratch of two pencils and tried to feel something other than the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from the sustained expenditure of hope. He took Mara's wedding ring from his wallet. He did this most nights the way some men take a drink or say a prayer as a ritual that organized the formless weight of missing her into something he could hold in his palm and examine. The ring was a simple gold band, nothing extravagant, chosen by two people who were spending their money on a down payment instead of jewelry. Mara had worn it every day for 12 years, touching it in the absent way she touched all the things she loved, and it still carried in some quality Reed could not have explained to anyone who asked the warmth of her hand. He sat with it until the twins were asleep. Then he put it back behind his driver's license and stared out at the empty road and thought about the $347 and the transmission in the for sale sign, whose number no one could read anymore, and he made the calculation that he made every night, the one that always came out to the same answer: tomorrow. You get through tonight and you figure out tomorrow. He did not know that tomorrow was already being planned in the narrow bunk 6 feet behind him by a 10-year-old girl who had her mother's handwriting and her mother's absolute refusal to accept that a situation could not be improved. He did not hear them get up. That was the thing he would return to later, the detail that would always soften something in his chest when he thought about it. He had been a light sleeper since Mara's illness, alert to nighttime sounds, the way parents of sick children become alert, And yet Lily and Finn had moved through the darkened RV with a stealth that suggested considerable advanced planning. Lily had retrieved Mara's old watercolor set from the storage compartment under the rear bench, the one with the tubes that had dried and cracked, but still held enough pigment. Lily had always insisted for small hands to create what she called real things. Finn had located the cardboard 3 pieces salvaged from a cereal box and a box that had held motor oil and had cut them to size with the craft scissors they kept in the supply bag. Reed found out about all of this the next morning when he woke at first light and pulled aside the curtain above the driver's seat and looked out at the road. There were 3 signs planted along the gravel shoulder, spaced perhaps 10 feet apart facing the road, with the confidence of things placed by people who believe in what they are saying. The lettering was Lily's, the careful cursive she had been practicing since second grade, decorated with the flowers and small geometric shapes that she added to everything she wrote. "Help us build a home," said the first sign, the words surrounded by painted daisies in yellow and white. "We have big dreams," said the second, illustrated with Finn's precise drawings of houses and gardens executed in Lily's watercolors. The third sign was the simplest and in some ways the most devastating. "Please stop." And beneath the words, a painted heart in the blue that Mara had always called impossible. Reed sat looking at them for a long moment. The shame came first, as it always did, hot and specific in his chest. His children were asking strangers for help because their father had run out of ways to help them himself. The signs reduced everything he had failed to accomplish to a few words on cardboard, visible to anyone who drove past on Millhaven Road, and the visibility was the part that made the shame physical rather than merely emotional. He reached for his boots. He was reaching for the door handle when he saw the car. It was a pale blue Buick of indeterminate vintage, and it had pulled off the road and stopped directly in front of the signs. As Reed watched the driver's door open and a woman got out. She was perhaps 68, small and deliberate in her movements, wearing a cardigan despite the mild March morning and carrying a thermos with the purposeful grip of someone who had brought it specifically for this occasion. She walked to the signs and read each one with the attention of a person who believes that written things deserve to be read properly. Then she looked at the RV. And Lily appeared at the RV's door because, of course, Lily had been awake since before dawn waiting for exactly this. Reed watched his daughter climb down the RV's steps and walk across the gravel to where the woman stood, and he watched the woman crouch slightly to be at eye level. And he watched Lily say something, and the woman laugh, a genuine laugh, the kind that comes from being surprised by delight. The woman opened her thermos and poured something into the ceramic mug she had brought along and handed it to Lily with both hands. Reed got out of the RV. The woman looked up as he approached. She had the eyes of someone who had spent a long career paying close attention to young people, and she turned them on Reed now with an assessment that was neither unkind nor uninformed. "Agnes Whitfield," she said. "I brought coffee. I hope you don't mind that I stopped." Reed looked at Lily, who was holding the ceramic mug in both hands, and watching him with an expression that contained in roughly equal measure hope and the preparedness for disappointment. He looked at the signs. He looked at Agnes Whitfield, who was waiting with the patience of a woman who had managed classrooms for 4 decades, and knew that the most important thing was sometimes simply to wait. "I was going to take the signs down," he said. Agnes considered this. "Were you?" she said. And then with perfect gentleness, "Why?" "Because we don't read," started and stopped. The sentence he had been about to complete, "because we don't ask strangers for help, because I am their father and fathers are supposed to manage these things." None of it came out because Lily was watching him, and Lily had her mother's eyes, and the answer to Agnes Whitfield's question was not, when he examined it honestly, a good one. "We needed to," Lily said quietly into the pause. "You always said there's no shame in asking for help when you really need it, Daddy." Reed did not remember saying this. He suspected it was the kind of thing he had said once in a better time, when it had been advice rather than instruction he would eventually need to follow himself. Agnes Whitfield stayed for 2 hours that first morning. She sat at the RV's tiny table with Lily's journal open before her, studying each page of house drawings with the seriousness of someone reviewing architectural plans. asking questions about load-bearing considerations and light orientation and which direction Lily wanted the kitchen windows to face. Finn appeared from behind his work at some point and began explaining the structural vulnerabilities of the RV's current foundation situation, and Agnes listened to him with the same focused attention, occasionally asking him to clarify a calculation. Before she left, she made a phone call. Reed listened from the driver's seat where he had retreated with his own cup of coffee and the complicated feeling of a man who has been maneuvered gently and expertly into accepting something he had not intended to accept. Walt Agnes said into her phone, "I need you to come out to the old Trentham lot on Millhaven Road. Bring your truck and call Roscoe. Tell him to bring whatever he's got in that storage unit. Yes, today. Because there's a family here who needs help building something, and I think you're going to want to be part of it." Walt Gruber arrived 40 minutes later in a pickup truck that had clearly been working for a living for many years. He was 62, broad through the shoulders, with the hands of someone who had spent his professional life in conversation with wood, and the patient expression of someone who had learned that most problems properly examined turned out to be construction problems. He climbed out of his truck and stood looking at the RV with the appraising eye of a craftsman evaluating a situation. He reached into the truck cab and produced a leather tool belt and held it out to Reed. "Found this at Beaumont's second-hand," he said. "3 weeks ago. Recognize the initials on the buckle." Reed looked at the belt. RC stamped into the leather of the buckle plate in the simple block letters he had pressed there himself with a leather stamp set the Christmas after he made foreman. He had sold the belt with the tools in the same transaction because the belt without the tools was just leather. His hands were not entirely steady when he took it. "I don't have tools to fill it," Reed said. Walt opened his tailgate. "Lucky for you, I've got extras." The morning reorganized itself around the arrival of Walt's truck. Walt spread Lily's journal drawings across the hood and began sketching in a notebook of his own, translating her artistic vision into structural plans with the fluency of someone who had been doing this for 4 decades. He talked while he sketched, explaining his reasoning, and Finn positioned himself at Walt's elbow and asked questions that Walt answered with complete seriousness, because Walt Gruber was the kind of man who understood that the most important thing you can do with a young person's intelligence is take it seriously. Roscoe Tanner arrived an hour after Walt, driving a flatbed trailer stacked with solar panels that caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant angles. He was 65, lean and deliberate, an electrical engineer who had spent 30 years at a utility company before early retirement and had spent the years since accumulating the kind of specialized knowledge that people assume has no practical application until they need it desperately. He had ordered the panels for a cabin project that had not materialized, he explained, and they had been sitting in his storage unit waiting for a purpose. 12 panels, Roscoe said, standing with his hands on his hips and looking at the RV's roof. "That'll give you enough electricity to run a small household. More than enough for a space this size once we expand it." "Once we expand it," Reed repeated. Roscoe looked at him steadily. "You're not planning to drive this thing anywhere, are you? Transmission's gone, axles got stress fractures, tires are older than my youngest grandkid. Way I see it, you've got 2 options. You can try to move it and it'll fall apart somewhere worse than this. Or you can commit to where you are and build something worth staying in." Reed looked at the lot. He looked at the tall grass and the wild chicory and the rusted for sale sign with its illegible number. He looked at Lily, who was showing Agnes the page of her journal where she had drawn the workshop with its north-facing windows for consistent light. He looked at Finn, who was asking Walt about foundation specifications with the focused intensity of someone who already knew the answer was achievable and was simply gathering the data to confirm it. He picked up a level from Walt's open toolbox and felt the familiar weight of it settle into his hand. "What kind of foundation are we talking about?" he said. That was how it started. Not with a plan, not with a budget, not with any of the things that Reed would have said in his previous life that a project required before it could begin. It started with a level and a question and 2 children who had already decided that the answer was yes. Claire Donovan arrived on the 4th day with her 16-year-old son, Connor, drawn by the combination of Agnes Whitfield's phone calls and the item that had appeared in the Millhaven Courier's community calendar section under the heading Neighbors Helping Neighbors. She drove a red pickup that had seen considerable use and parked it with the efficiency of someone accustomed to arriving at situations that required immediate practical engagement. She was 36, Irish dark in the way of certain Appalachian families, with the competence of someone who had been managing things alone for longer than she had expected to. Connor was out of the truck before it stopped moving, already scanning the construction site with the evaluating eye of a 16-year-old who had been reading about sustainable architecture with the focused dedication that some teenagers bring to the things they genuinely love. He introduced himself to Finn by immediately disagreeing with his calculation about the optimal panel angle for maximum winter exposure, and Finn responded by producing his notebook and showing Connor the supporting mathematics. And within 10 minutes, they were sitting cross-legged in the grass, working through the trigonometry together with the absorbed concentration of two people who have found an unexpected equal. Claire introduced herself to Reed with a firm handshake and an immediate and practical question about what still needed doing, and Reed found himself explaining the foundation plan and the electrical routing and the structural expansion he and Walt had been working through, and she listened with the attention of someone who had been solving her own construction problems for years and understood the language. She had brought food. This turned out to be characteristic. Claire Donovan's primary mode of practical care was the preparation and delivery of food, a language she had learned from necessity and elevated over years of solo parenthood and community involvement to something approaching art. She set up a folding table near the RV and began producing sandwiches and a thermos of coffee and a container of oatmeal cookies that Lily identified immediately with the unerring instinct of a 10-year-old as the best cookies she had ever encountered. "You bake," Lily said with the reverence of someone naming a sacred attribute. "I do," Claire said. "Your mom did too, I'm guessing." Lily's face did something complicated. "She kept a box of her recipes," Lily said. "We still have it. We brought it with us." Claire looked at Reed and Reed looked at the middle distance, and Claire nodded once and said, "That's good. That's exactly the kind of thing worth keeping." By the end of the first week, the work had found its rhythm. Walt arrived each morning with his truck and his decades of accumulated craft knowledge, and Reed arrived each morning with the recovered instincts of a foreman who had spent 15 years seeing finished things inside unfinished materials. They had developed the shorthand of two skilled men working toward the same vision, a communication that was mostly gesture and the shared grammar of construction rather than words. Walt would indicate a problem with a tilt of his head, and Reed would already be revising the solution before Walt finished the movement. The foundation work was Reed's particular domain. He had poured concrete in every configuration the profession required under conditions ranging from cooperative to actively hostile, and he approached the footings for the RV expansion with the precise care of someone who understood that everything built above depended on the exactness of what was built below. He worked with a plumb line and a transit-level checking and rechecking because he had learned early in his career that the errors you make at the foundation are the errors you live with for the life of the building. Finn documented everything. He had promoted himself to official project engineer, a title he had awarded himself without consulting anyone, and that everyone had immediately accepted as accurate. And he moved through the work site with his notebook, recording specifications and materials and timelines with the methodical attention of someone compiling a record that would be consulted for reference. He asked Walt and Roscoe and Reed questions that were sometimes so precisely aimed at the exact load-bearing issue they had just been discussing privately that Reed began to suspect Finn of understanding more than he was letting on. Lily drew. She drew the worksite each day, a running visual record of transformation, and she drew new pages of the house as it revealed itself in the construction, adding details and refining proportions as the actual structure began to diverge from and improve upon her imagination. She had also begun on her own initiative to organize the volunteers, attaching herself to Agnes Whitfield and absorbing through some combination of proximity and native talent Agnes's particular skill for understanding what each person needed in order to contribute their best. There were more volunteers by the end of the second week. Word moved through Millhaven the way word moves through small towns, faster and with more detail than anyone who had not experienced it would expect. The feed store owner sent his nephew with a truck of lumber. The Methodist congregation sent 6 members with tools and a collective willingness that made up for varying skill levels. A retired plumber named Bernard Oakes appeared one morning, examined the bathroom situation with professional dismay, and spent 3 days correcting what he called a creative approach to water pressure. His wife brought casseroles. Reed organized all of it. He had not appointed himself project manager in any formal sense. It had simply happened a gravity that pulled resources and effort into orbit around a competent center. He held the plan in his head the way he had always held construction plans, as a three-dimensional object he could rotate and examine from any angle, and he made the daily decisions that moved the project from where it was toward where it needed to be with the efficiency of someone doing the thing he was built to do. His tool belt was full now. Walt and Roscoe and the other volunteers had contributed tools gradually in the offhand way of people who want to give a gift without making it feel like charity. And Reed had accepted them in the same spirit, adding them to the belt as they arrived until it sat across his hips with the comfortable weight of professional identity restored. It was Roscoe who said the thing about the SUV. They were at the end of the second week packing up tools in the long light of a Tennessee evening, the kind of evening that makes the hills look painted rather than real. Roscoe was coiling extension cord with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had coiled extension cord 10,000 times, and he said it the way he said most things, as a piece of information being offered without particular emphasis. "You notice that black SUV," he said. Reed looked up. "End of the road there. Nashville plates. Been there most mornings this week, gone by noon." Reed looked toward the road. The shoulder was empty in the fading light. He turned it over in his mind the way he turned most things over, looking for the weight of it, trying to assess whether it was something that required action or simply part of the ambient texture of a place he did not yet know well. "Probably someone who read about the project," he said. "Curious." Probably Roscoe agreed with the tone of a man who has offered information and is content to let the other person decide what to do with it. Reed looked at the road a moment longer. Then he went back to coiling his own extension cord, and the evening closed around them, and the chirping of the spring crickets in the tall grass filled the space where his attention had briefly been. Inside the RV, Lily was adding a new element to her journal drawing of the house. She had drawn it 100 times, but this version had something the others lacked. Above the roof line in the careful watercolor blue that she had been using for the signs, she had painted a sky with stars, and in the stars, in letters too small to read from any distance, but perfectly legible up close, she had written, "Home is where love lives." Reed found it later after the twins were asleep, when he sat at the table with his coffee and the plans for the following day's work. He sat looking at it for a long time. Then he took Mara's ring from his wallet and held it in his palm, and he looked at the drawing, and he thought that she would have known immediately and without needing to be told what their daughter had understood before either of her parents. That some things are worth asking for. That asking is not the same as failing. That a sign painted by a 10-year-old's hand in her dead mother's watercolors, planted in the ground of a town they had not planned to stop in front of a house they had not yet built, was not a confession of defeat. It was a foundation. Outside, the spring night settled over Millhaven with the tenderness of seasons that do not know they are being waited for. The solar panels that Roscoe had mounted on the reinforced roof caught the moonlight and held it. The concrete footings they had poured that afternoon were curing in the dark, taking on the density and permanence of things that have found their final form. The road at the edge of the lot lay empty in both directions, leading toward the town that had not yet decided what it thought of them, and away from everything that had been lost. And at the far end of the road, just past the reach of the lot's perimeter light, the black SUV with the Nashville plates sat in the darkness with its engine off and its windows up, and the man inside it was looking at a photograph on his phone of the solar panels on the RV roof and the concrete footings in the ground and the 3 cardboard signs that still stood at the edge of the road. And he was typing a message to someone whose name was not in his contacts under his real name. The message said, community investment phase proceeding faster than projected. Recommend accelerating the timeline. He sent it. He started the engine. He drove away before the light changed. And inside the RV, Reed Calloway finally slept for the first time in weeks, with the quality of sleep that comes to men who have spent a day building something with their hands and can feel, even in unconsciousness, the satisfying geometry of a day's work that left the world more ordered than they found it. The ring was in his wallet. The plans were on the table. The foundation was curing in the dark. Tomorrow he would start on the framing. The framing went up in the third week of April, and Reed Calloway stood back on the morning they raised the first wall section and felt something move through him that he had not felt in so long. He had almost forgotten it had a name. It was not happiness exactly. It was closer to the sensation of a dislocated joint returning to its socket, a rightness that was inseparable from the pain of having been wrong for so long. Walt Gruber worked beside him with the wordless efficiency of a man who had raised 1,000 wall sections and understood that the moments worth marking were the ones you let pass in silence rather than the ones you talk through. They had developed over 3 weeks of shared work, the trust that exists between skilled tradesmen who have learned each other's rhythm the way musicians learn each other's tendencies and leave space accordingly. Walt would anticipate Reed's next move by a half second, and Reed would adjust his own timing to accommodate Walt's adjustments, and the result was work that moved faster and cleaner than either of them could have managed alone. Finn had calculated the framing dimensions to within a 1/16 of an inch. He stood at the corner of the foundation with his notebook and called out measurements in the precise monotone of someone reading from an instrument, and Reed cut to those measurements without checking twice, because in 3 weeks he had learned that Finn's numbers were reliable in the way that good instruments are reliable, not because they were approximate, but because they were exact. The expansion they were building would double the RV's footprint. A wraparound deck on the southern and eastern faces, partially enclosed on the eastern side, to create what Lily's journal called the morning room, a space with windows on 3 sides where the light would come in golden at sunrise, the way she had drawn it 100 times. A workshop addition on the northern face, properly ventilated with the north-facing windows that Reed had specified for even light without glare. Raised garden beds along the western perimeter, their dimensions precise enough that Lily had already assigned specific plants to specific sections in her journal laid out in colored pencil, with the orderly ambition of someone who had been thinking about this for longer than the project had existed. It was taking shape. The people of Millhaven drove past on Millhaven Road and slowed, and some of them stopped, and the ones who stopped generally found reasons to return, and the ones who returned generally found themselves holding a tool or a hammer or a tray of sandwiches within 20 minutes of arrival. Because Claire Donovan had developed a system for converting observers into participants that operated with the smooth inevitability of a well-designed machine. Claire had become the social architecture of the project in the same way that Reed had become its structural architecture. She understood with the intuitive precision of someone who had spent years navigating the social geography of small Tennessee towns exactly which volunteer needed to be paired with, which task, which conversation needed to happen, before which offer of help would be accepted, which gesture of inclusion would open which door. She did all of this without apparent effort, which Reed recognized as the sign of someone for whom the effort had become internalized through long practice. He watched her work sometimes from across the construction site with a detached professional appreciation of one skilled person observing another's craft. She moved through the volunteers the way a good foreman moves through a job site, checking, adjusting, encouraging, redirecting, always with the attention that makes people feel seen rather than managed. It was a skill he had once possessed and had let atrophy during the years of grief and displacement, and watching Claire exercise it reminded him that it was a skill, not an innate quality, which meant it could be recovered. Connor had essentially moved his community college coursework to the construction site. He arrived each morning with his sustainable architecture textbooks and his laptop in the focused energy of a 16-year-old who has found the intersection of what he loves and what the world actually needs. He and Finn had formed a technical partnership that operated largely independently of the adult project, running parallel calculations and proposing refinements that were frequently more elegant than the original plans. It was Connor who suggested the rainwater collection system, sketching it out one afternoon on a piece of graph paper with the offhand confidence of someone presenting an obvious solution. Roscoe Tanner looked at the sketch for approximately 30 seconds and then said, "That'll work," and the conversation moved immediately to implementation. Without ceremony, without deliberation. Just the clean, direct movement from good idea to good execution that happens when skilled people trust each other. On a Wednesday evening in the fourth week of April, after the volunteers had gone and the twins were occupied with homework at the table that Claire had contributed from her garage, Reed sat on the partially completed deck with a cup of coffee and watched the stars appear over the Tennessee hills. The air smelled of fresh lumber and turned earth and the wild onion that grew in patches along the creek bed 50 yards east of the lot. It was the smell of a place becoming specific, becoming theirs in the way that places do when you have spent enough days working them with your hands. He was thinking about the black SUV. It had appeared 3 more times since Roscoe first mentioned it, always in the early morning, always gone by noon. Reed had not mentioned it to anyone else. He filed it in the category of things that might be something or might be nothing, a category that had grown considerably during the years of managing Mara's illness, when the difference between a symptom worth worrying about and background noise had been the most important judgment he was required to make. He was not certain he had always made it correctly. There was a quality to the SUV's presence that he could not quite name. The way it was always in the same position, far enough from the lot to be deniable, but close enough to have a clear sight line to the construction. The fact that it was always gone before the main body of volunteers arrived. These were patterns, and patterns in Reed's experience did not generally assemble themselves without a reason. He let it sit in the back of his mind, unresolved, the way he let certain structural questions sit while other parts of the project moved forward. Sometimes the answer came when you weren't looking for it. It was Claire who found Mara's recipe box. She had been helping Reed reorganize the RV's interior in preparation for the transition to the expanded living space, working through the storage compartments under the rear bench with the systematic efficiency she brought to all organizational tasks. Reed was outside checking the deck framing when he heard her go quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when they encounter something that requires a different kind of attention. He came inside to find her sitting on the edge of the rear bench with the wooden box in her lap. It was painted yellow with small flowers around the edges in blue and white, the paint worn smooth at the corners from years of hands lifting the lid. Mara had inherited it from her grandmother and had treated it with the reverence that some objects accumulate through the quality of care they receive. Inside, hundreds of index cards filed by category, each one covered in Mara's precise handwriting, the letters small and even and slightly forward-leaning, in the way of people who learned penmanship in the 80s and never entirely lost the habit. Reed stood in the doorway. "I'm sorry," Claire said immediately. "I wasn't trying to go through your things. It was in the compartment with the kitchen supplies, and I thought it was a storage container for utensils." Reed looked at the box. He had not opened it since Mara died. It had traveled with them through every displacement, every parking lot and campground, and borrowed driveway, packed in the same compartment with the spatulas and the can opener, because he could not have explained to anyone who asked why he needed to keep it close without admitting things about the nature of grief that he was not ready to admit. "It's her recipes," he said. Claire looked down at the card she was holding. She had not meant to read it, he could see that, but it was in her hand and the words were in front of her, and she read them the way you read something that is already happening before you decide whether to let it happen. Her expression changed in a way Reed recognized the look of someone who has unexpectedly encountered a stranger's private tenderness and been moved by it before they had time to be embarrassed. She turned the card so he could see it. It was the card for a chicken and dumpling recipe, and in the margin in Mara's handwriting was a note that was not part of the recipe. "Add extra love when cooking for someone who's hurting. Not as a joke, not as decoration, as instruction." Reed looked at the note for a long moment. He had seen it before, had read it years ago when Mara first wrote it and had asked her what she meant, and she had said exactly what it says. Read, some things you have to put intention into or they don't come out right. He had thought he understood what she meant then. He was not sure he had understood until this moment, standing in the doorway of his broken vehicle that was becoming a home, watching a woman he had known for 3 weeks, holding his dead wife's handwriting with the care of someone who understood its weight. Claire made pancakes the following Saturday morning from the recipe on the card that had Mara's handwriting across the top in Lily's favorite category section Saturday mornings. She arrived at 7 with grocery bags and set up at the camp stove, with Connor's help working from the card with the focused attention of someone determined to do something right. Reed was outside checking the framing when Lily appeared in the doorway and announced in a voice that contained wonder in roughly equal proportions to hunger that there were butterfly pancakes and dinosaur pancakes, and that Connor's dinosaurs looked more like chickens, but that was acceptable given that he was trying. He came inside. The small space was warm with the smell of butter and vanilla, the smell that Mara had made on Saturday mornings for as long as any of them could remember. Lily and Finn were at the table syrup already accomplished on Finn's notebook cover, which he examined with the expression of someone deciding whether to be annoyed before concluding the pancakes were worth it. Connor was at the stove attempting a triceratops with a confidence that significantly exceeded his execution. Claire set a plate in front of Lily. Lily looked at it. She picked up her fork. She took a bite and sat with it for a moment with the stillness of a child processing something that requires more than eating. Mommy's tasted like remembering, Lily said. Yours tastes like hoping. The room was quiet. Connor put down the spatula. Finn looked up from his notebook. Claire stood at the stove with her back to the room for a moment longer than the situation required, and when she turned around, her expression had the quality of someone who has heard something true, stated with a precision they could not have achieved themselves. Reed had come inside without deciding to. That was how it worked now. He noticed the threshold crossed before the debate finished. 3 months ago, he would have stood outside. He sat down at the table with his children and Claire and Connor and ate Saturday morning pancakes from his dead wife's recipe, cooked by a woman who had added vanilla that the recipe didn't call for, and whose butterfly wings were more impressionistic than anatomically correct. And he felt for the first time in a period he could not precisely measure that the weight he had been carrying was distributed across more than one set of shoulders. It was not a small feeling. It was one of the largest feelings he had experienced since the day the doctor had used the word terminal and the floor had gone out from under him in a way that he had spent 3 years trying to find his footing from. He ate his pancakes and did not say anything about it because it was not the kind of thing you said at a breakfast table with children present and syrup on the notebook. But he felt it with the complete physical reality of something that is happening in your chest rather than your mind. Garrison Price arrived on a Tuesday morning in early June. Reed saw him from the roof of the workshop addition where he was checking the flashing around the new skylight that Roscoe and Connor had installed the previous afternoon. The car was a silver Mercedes, and it parked with the precision of someone accustomed to parking in places where their parking communicated something. The man who got out was 48 in a charcoal suit that was too expensive for a construction site, and that he wore with the complete indifference of someone who had never needed to consider whether his clothes were appropriate for a situation. He was carrying a manila envelope in one hand and looking at his phone in the other, and he walked toward the RV with the deliberate pace of someone who has done this before and is not concerned about the outcome. Reed came down from the roof. He did not know why he felt what he felt in the moment of seeing Price, the alertness that ran through him like current through a wire. It was the suit partly, in the car, in the manila envelope, with its official implications. But it was also something else, something his pattern-recognizing mind had already begun to assemble, without his conscious permission, drawing a line between the black SUV with the Nashville plates and the silver Mercedes with the Nashville plates and the manila envelope in the hand of a man who had driven from Nashville to stand in a lot in Mill Haven on a Tuesday morning. Garrison Price, the man said, extending his hand with the practiced warmth of someone who has learned that warmth delivered at the correct moment can delay resistance by several minutes. He named the firm he worked for, and then with the smooth inevitability of someone executing a prepared sequence, he named the client. Vantage Development Corporation. Reed shook the hand. He did not say anything. I want to start by saying that what you and your community have accomplished here is genuinely impressive, Price said, gesturing toward the expanded structure. The craftsmanship, the community organization, the sustainable systems integration. It's a remarkable project. Reed waited. Price opened the manila envelope and produced a document package that he held out with both hands in the manner of someone presenting something that has been carefully prepared. Reed took it. He looked at the top page. He read the letterhead and the case number and the property description and the name of the filing party, and he read the section heading that said, Notice of Property Development and Required Relocation. And he felt the floor do the thing it had done before, the thing he had spent 3 years trying not to feel again. Vantage Development Corporation purchased this property 14 months ago, Price said through an acquiring subsidiary. All documentation is in order. Development permits for a mixed-use commercial project were approved by the County Planning Commission in February. The timeline for groundbreaking is 90 days from the date of this notice, which means the current occupants of the property are required to vacate within 60 days. Reed read. He read slowly with the methodical attention of someone who has learned that documents contain both what they say and what they do not say, and that the space between those two things is where the important information lives. He turned pages. He read the permit numbers and the approval dates and the signatures of the county planning commissioners and the environmental impact study reference numbers and the traffic study citations. Connor had appeared at his shoulder. Reed had not heard him approach, but Connor was there, and Connor had his phone out, and Connor was photographing each page as Reed turned it, with the efficient urgency of someone who understands that documents in hand are documents that can be studied, and documents that have been handed back are documents that require a subpoena. 60 days is quite generous, actually, Price continued. The standard notice period under Tennessee property law is 30 days. Vantage is prepared to offer a relocation package that includes funds sufficient to purchase a comparable property within the county moving expenses and a supplementary amount in recognition of the community investment in the site improvements. Agnes Whitfield's car had pulled up, then Walt's truck. They had been due to arrive at 8 for the day's work, and it was 8, and they were arriving and they were getting out of their vehicles and reading the situation with the precision that people develop when they have spent weeks in daily proximity with someone and have learned to read the weather in his posture. Walt looked at Price. He looked at the Mercedes. He looked at the manila envelope in Reed's hand. He said nothing. He came and stood beside Reed with the unhurried deliberateness of someone taking a position. Agnes came and stood on Reed's other side. They hired someone to watch us, Connor said quietly, not looking up from his phone. He had reached the section of the document package that contained the development timeline and was photographing it with particular attention. Look at this date. Vantage knew someone was developing this site in April. The black SUV, Reed said. Connor nodded. They knew what we were building. They could see from the road that the site improvements were increasing the property value. And they waited. They let us finish before they served the notice. Price maintained his professional composure with the practiced steadiness of someone who has been in contentious situations before and knows that composure is itself a negotiating position. The improvements made to the property were made by parties who were occupying the property without legal authorization. Vantage bears no responsibility for decisions made by unauthorized occupants. Lily had come outside. Finn was behind her. They stood on the deck that they had helped build in front of the morning room windows that let in the gold light that Lily had drawn in her journal 100 times before it existed. And they looked at the man in the charcoal suit with the combined expression of two 10-year-olds who understand exactly what is happening and are deciding what to do about it. You were watching us, Lily said. She was not asking. Price looked at her with the expression of a man who has been told to maintain professional composure and is finding it marginally more difficult than anticipated. My client was monitoring its property investment, yes. While we built our house on it, Finn said. This is not a negotiation I'm going to have with children, Price said, and something in his voice shifted a degree of warmth, dropping away, revealing a cooler register beneath. Reed folded the document package. He looked at Price with the specific attention of a man who is adding new information to a calculation that has been running for some time. He said, "Thank you for the notice." And he turned and went inside the RV, and he sat at the table with the document package in front of him, and he began to read it again from the beginning. That evening, after the volunteers had dispersed and the twins were in their bunks and the lot was quiet, Reed sat at the table for 6 hours. He read all 212 pages of the document package. He read the environmental impact study and the traffic analysis and the community input session records and the planning commission meeting minutes and the permit approval letters and the timeline documents and the financial projections and the subsidiary company filings that had concealed Vantage's involvement in the original property purchase. He read with the methodical attention of a foreman reading construction plans, which is to say he read with the understanding that every document tells you what was built, and also if you know how to look where the foundations are weak. It took him until 2 in the morning to find what he was looking for. The environmental impact study had been conducted by a consulting firm called Meridian Environmental Associates. The study was dated February 3rd through February 28th. Reed had spent enough years working construction projects that required environmental clearance to know what a proper study looked like, what it measured, and when and how, and the Meridian study had a problem that was visible if you knew what you were reading. The wildlife surveys had been conducted on February 7th, February 14th, and February 21st. February in Tennessee, when the migratory birds had not yet returned, when the amphibians were dormant, when the insect populations that served as the foundation of the local food web were underground or in larval stages. The study's species counts reflected a biological winter snapshot and used those winter numbers to characterize the site's ecological significance, which was the equivalent of photographing a forest in January and concluding that forests do not have leaves. Reed turned to the traffic analysis. It had been conducted on a Tuesday in January between the hours of 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. The county school district's bus routes, which Reed had looked up on the county website, because he had had occasion to think about school buses during the weeks when the twins had been picked up by the Millhaven Elementary bus at the end of Millhaven Road, ran past the lot at 7:45 in the morning and 3:20 in the afternoon. The traffic analysis had measured nothing during either of those windows. He turned to the community input session records. 3 sessions had been held in October and November of the previous year at the county planning office on Courthouse Square. The sessions had been scheduled at 10 in the morning on weekdays. The notification had been posted in the legal notices section of the Millhaven Courier on the required schedule, which satisfied the legal requirement for public notice, and was also Reed recognized a method of notification specifically chosen for its ineffectiveness, because legal notices in small newspapers are read almost exclusively by people whose job requires them to read legal notices. Reed sat back. He looked at what he had found. He turned it over in his mind with the same deliberateness he brought to structural problems, examining it from multiple angles, checking his own reasoning for the places where it might be wrong. It was not that anything Vantage had done was explicitly illegal. The environmental study had been conducted within the required time window. The traffic study had measured what it was required to measure. The community input sessions had been properly noticed and properly held. Every element of the permit application was on its face technically compliant. But technical compliance and good faith compliance were two different things, and Reed had spent 15 years on construction sites where the distinction mattered, where an inspector could sign off on work that met the letter of the code while failing its spirit, and where the failure became visible later in the places where the building met the stress it was designed to bear. He knew what he had found. What he did not know yet was what to do with it. He thought about it until 3 in the morning. Then he made a decision, the kind that feels when you make it less like a choice than like the completion of a process that has been running without your full awareness, surfacing now into consciousness because it is finished and requires only acknowledgement. He was going to take this to Bertie Alcott. Bertie Alcott was this county's director of planning services, and Reed had met her twice, once when she had come out to the lot to assess the permit situation for the RV expansion, and once at the Methodist Church community meeting where Agnes had organized the initial response to Price's visit. She was 44, methodical and precise, with a combination of institutional knowledge and genuine civic commitment that produced in Reed's experience the most effective kind of bureaucrat, the kind who understood the rules well enough to know when the rules were being gamed and cared enough about their purpose to do something about it. He called her at 7 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, which told him she was already at her desk, which told him something useful about her. "I have some questions about the Vantage Development Permit process," he said. "I've been reading the documentation. I think there are procedural issues worth examining." There was a pause on Bertie Alcott's end that had a quality Reed recognized, the pause of someone encountering information that slots into a framework they have already been constructing privately. "Come in this afternoon," she said. "Bring the documents." Connor drove him. Reed sat in the passenger seat of the red pickup with the document package on his lap, and the feeling of a man going into a situation that he has prepared for as thoroughly as the available time permitted. He had spent the morning making notes, organizing his findings in the sequence that would be most legible to someone who needed to understand not just what was wrong, but why it mattered. Bertie Alcott's office was on the second floor of the county building, a room whose walls were covered with zoning maps and permit flow charts, and the accumulated paper evidence of a career spent navigating the intersection of development and regulation. She sat across from Reed with the document package spread between them and listened to him present his findings with the focused attention of someone taking information seriously rather than waiting for a pause to respond. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You read all 212 pages," she said. "I've read construction documents for 15 years, Reed said. "I know what they're supposed to look like." Bertie looked at the environmental study dates. She looked at the traffic analysis window. She looked at the community input session schedule. She looked at Reed. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I'm going to be honest with you. Some of what you've identified was noticed during the internal review process. There were questions raised about the adequacy of the environmental study in particular. Those questions were addressed in writing by Meridian Environmental Associates with a supplementary letter that the commission accepted as sufficient." Reed looked at her steadily. "And the traffic study and the input session timing. The traffic study meets the minimum requirement. The input sessions were properly noticed and held." "Minimum requirements," Reed said. "Properly noticed." Bertie looked at him for a long moment. She was deciding something. He could see it, weighing the institutional imperatives of her position against the other thing, the thing that had presumably motivated her to spend 20 years in a county planning office rather than somewhere more comfortable. "What you have," she said carefully, "is not grounds for permit revocation. What you have is grounds for a comprehensive review. There is a difference. A review does not guarantee the outcome you're hoping for, but it does require the commission to address each of the procedural questions you've raised on the record in a public proceeding." Reed understood the distinction. He had dealt with enough inspectors and permit offices to know the difference between a decision and a process, and to know that a process properly invoked created obligations and timelines and public records that changed the landscape of what was possible. "How long does a comprehensive review take?" he asked. "Minimum 90 days, Bertie said. "If the commission identifies additional questions that require outside technical review, it could extend to 180. Reed nodded once. "I'll need to submit a formal request," he said, "in writing citing the specific procedural concerns." "Yes," Bertie said, "you will." He sat at the table in the RV that night and wrote the request by hand in the careful block printing he used for construction documents, citing each procedural concern in the sequence Bertie had indicated would be most effective. Connor sat across from him, translating the handwritten document into a typed version on his laptop, asking clarifying questions about specific regulatory citations that Reed answered from memory and from the notes he had made that morning. The letter was 4 pages. It cited 11 specific procedural concerns. It requested a comprehensive review of the Vantage Development Corporation permit approval on the grounds of inadequate environmental assessment methodology, insufficient traffic impact analysis, and community input procedures designed to minimize rather than facilitate public participation. Reed signed it at midnight. Connor printed it at the library the following morning. Reed delivered it to Bertie Alcott's office in person, with a copy hand-delivered to the county clerk's office for the public record, and a third copy that he kept in the manila folder he had labeled in his careful block printing evidence. He had not told the community about any of this yet. He had been working alone with Connor's logistical help because he had learned during the years of managing Mara's illness that some things required the kind of focused attention that consultation interrupted. You gathered the information, you assessed it, you made the decision, and then you told the people who needed to know. He told them that evening at the Methodist church, standing at the front of the fellowship hall, with the folding chairs filled, and the faces of the people who had given their weekends and their skills and their materials to build something they believed in, looking back at him. He had not been a public speaker in any formal sense. He had given job site briefings for 15 years, addressed crews of 20 and 30 workers on project status and safety protocols and schedule adjustments. But that was professional communication, structured and purposeful in a way that left little room for the kind of uncertainty he was standing in now. He was not certain of the outcome. He was not able to offer the people in these chairs the assurance that their work would be preserved. What he could offer them was the truth of what he had found and what he had done with it, and the judgment that it was worth fighting for. He told them about the environmental study dates. He told them about the traffic analysis window. He told them about the input session schedule. He watched their faces change as they understood not just that Vantage had gamed the process, but the specific mechanism by which the gaming had been accomplished, the way a technically compliant procedure had been constructed to produce a predetermined result. He told them about the letter he had delivered to Bertie Alcott's office. He told them that a comprehensive review meant 90 days minimum, and that 90 days was time, and that time was the thing they needed most. Agnes Whitfield started the petition the following morning. She had done this kind of thing before she told Reed when she called to inform him of her plan in the context of school board elections and library funding campaigns and the unsuccessful but spirited effort to prevent the closure of the town's last hardware store 4 years ago. She knew how to move through Millhaven in a way that produced signatures, which was to say she knew everyone and they knew her and trusted her judgment about what was worth their name. Claire and Connor launched the crowdfunding campaign that afternoon. Connor had researched the platforms and identified the one most likely to reach the demographic, most likely to respond to their specific story. And he had been right about this in the way that he was generally right about things he had researched thoroughly. By the end of the first week, the campaign had raised $62,000 from donors in 31 states, most of whom had found it through a social media post that a woman in Nashville had shared because it made her cry on her lunch break. Reed read the comments sometimes late at night. They were from people he had never met in places he had never been, who had seen something in a family story that connected to something in their own. People who had lost things. People who had been told that a situation was unchangeable and had changed it anyway. People who recognized in the image of 2 children's watercolor signs planted in the gravel of a Tennessee morning something that they needed to see. He did not fully understand it. He was a man who worked with his hands and trusted tangible things, and the intangible power of a story moving through a network of strangers was not entirely legible to him. But he felt it the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before the weather shifts. Something was building. On the evening before the hearing, Reed found Lily's journal open on the table. She had fallen asleep at it, her head on her folded arms, the colored pencils scattered around her. He stood looking at the page she had been working on. She had drawn the courtroom. She had never been in a courtroom. She had drawn it from imagination and probably from photographs, a high-ceilinged room with tall windows and rows of seats and a raised bench where a figure sat in robes. She had drawn people at the tables in front of the bench, and she had drawn a figure in the witness box that she had rendered in the particular way she rendered herself in drawing, small and upright and unafraid. Above the courtroom in the careful watercolor blue she used for all the most important words she had written. "We will win because we are right." Reed stood looking at it for a long time. Then he reached into his wallet. He had done this most nights for 3 years, the ritual of the ring, the gold band, and the tissue paper in its familiar weight. But tonight he did not hold it and set it back. He set it on the table beside Lily's journal and left his wallet on the other side of it. A small distance, the first distance, he did not put it back. He stood there in the quiet of the almost finished house that his children had summoned from a cardboard sign and a stranger's willingness to stop. And he looked at the ring on the table and the drawing in the journal and the sleeping face of his daughter. And he thought that Mara had known at the end, not with certainty, but with something stronger than certainty, because it was rooted in love rather than evidence. She had known that he would find his way back. She had made him promise to take care of their babies, knowing that taking care of them would require him to take care of himself, and that taking care of himself would require him to find again the man who knew how to build things, who knew how to read a document and find its weakness, who knew how to stand in front of a room full of people and tell them the truth and ask them to stand with him. Tomorrow he would stand in a courtroom and do the same thing. He covered Lily with the blanket from the back of the couch, the one Claire had brought from her house because it was the warmest one she owned. He moved the colored pencils carefully so they would not roll off the table in the night. He turned off the lamp. He went to bed in the room that had been built by the hands of people who had decided that some things were worth building, and he lay in the darkness, and he did not take the ring back from the table. He left it there beside his daughter's drawing, waiting for morning. The courthouse in Hardin County sat at the center of a square that had been designed in the optimistic era of its construction to project permanence and civic dignity. The brick was the deep red of old Tennessee clay, darkened at the corners by a century of weather, and the columns at the entrance were the kind of columns that communicated to anyone who understood architectural language that the people who built this place believed in the weight of what happened inside it. Reed Calloway had driven past courthouses his entire life without giving them particular thought. He gave this one considerable thought as he stood at the bottom of its steps on a Tuesday morning in late June with the manila folder of documents under his arm and the stillness that comes to men who have prepared as thoroughly as preparation allows and are now required to wait for the thing itself. Walt Gruber was there. He had arrived before Reed, which did not surprise Reed because Walt Gruber was the kind of man who arrived before things happened rather than at them. He was wearing the cleanest version of the clothes he always wore, dark canvas work pants and a button shirt, and he stood with his hands in his pockets in the way of a man who is present and ready and has nothing left to prove by being anything other than what he is. Agnes Whitfield stood beside him with the roll petition under her arm and the expression of a woman who has organized enough community actions to know that the work done before the event determines its outcome more than anything that happens during it. She had collected 647 signatures. She had stopped counting when she ran out of pages, which was not when she ran out of people willing to sign. Claire was there with Connor, who was carrying a laptop bag and wearing the slightly formal approximation of professional clothing that 16-year-olds produce when they have decided that an occasion matters. He had been up until 1 in the morning preparing a supplementary document that organized the crowdfunding data into a format that demonstrated community investment in a manner he described to Reed as legally adjacent to financial testimony. Reed had looked at it and said it was good work because it was. Lily held her journal against her chest with both arms, the way she held it when she needed it to be close rather than open. Finn had his notebook. He had also, Reed noticed, written a series of calculations on his left palm in ballpoint pen, which was Finn's version of studying for a test. Bertie Alcott was waiting for them inside the entrance, which told Reed that she had decided something in the days since he had delivered the letter to her office. The way she had positioned herself just inside the door rather than at the top of the steps was the positioning of someone who has chosen to be present without choosing to be visible. And Reed filed this in the category of useful information without making more of it than it was. The courtroom was already filling when they entered. Reed had not anticipated the number of people. He had known that word had traveled, that the crowdfunding campaign had made their situation legible to people across a geography that extended far beyond Millhaven, that the Millhaven Courier had run 2 front-page stories, and that a regional television station had sent a camera crew that had filmed for an afternoon and run a segment that led the 6 o'clock news. But knowing these things abstractly was different from standing in the entrance of a county courtroom and seeing the rows of benches filled with faces. He recognized people who had driven from Millhaven and from the surrounding towns, and who had come, he understood, not because they were required to, but because they had decided this was where they needed to be. The community quilt was there. Agnes had brought it rolled and carried by 6 of the volunteers who had contributed squares, and it had been unrolled and hung across the back wall of the courtroom during the lunch recess the previous day when Agnes had arrived at the courthouse with the quilt and the calm authority of a 68-year-old woman who has decided that something is going to happen and is simply waiting for the room to adjust to that fact. The bailiff had looked at her with the expression of a man whose job description did not include adjudicating textile disputes, and had decided in the way that people generally decided when Agnes Whitfield was on the other side of a question that accommodation was the correct response. The quilt covered the back wall from doorframe to doorframe. It was not a subtle object. Each square told a fragment of the story in the visual language of the person who had made it. Walt's square with the crossed hammer and saw, Agnes's square with the schoolhouse and the open book, Roscoe's with the solar panel geometry and careful needlepoint, Connor's square modern and angular with the sustainable architecture drawings he had made during the project, rendered in precise cross-stitch. And in the center, Lily's square, the one she had painted in Mara's watercolors, the house surrounded by gardens and friends with the sky full of impossible blue stars, and the words, "Home is where love lives," written in letters small enough to require approaching to read. Garrison Price sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 colleagues, their briefcases and document binders arranged with the organized confidence of people who have done this many times in many courtrooms and are accustomed to the outcome. Price had glanced at Reed when he entered and offered the same professionally calibrated expression he had brought to everything, the expression of a man who regards his emotions as instruments to be deployed rather than states to be felt. Reed had looked back at him with nothing in particular and taken his seat. The attorney beside Reed was a man named David Marsh, a Knoxville attorney who had driven to Millhaven after reading the crowdfunding campaign description and offered his services for the cost of his gas, because he told Reed he had grown up in a town like Millhaven and had watched things like this happen to families like Reed's, and had spent 20 years in law school and practice waiting for a case where he could do something about it. Reed had assessed him by asking him specific questions and listening to the quality of his answers, and David Marsh's answers had the quality of someone who had read everything and understood most of it. Judge Patricia Crane entered the courtroom with the deliberate pace of a woman who had presided over this room for 22 years and had long since stopped needing to establish her authority through anything more than presence. She was 61, with silver hair cut practically short, and the expression of someone who has heard every version of every argument and is interested primarily in the ones that have not been made before. She surveyed the packed courtroom without apparent reaction, noted the quilt on the back wall with a glance that lasted exactly long enough to take it in, and arranged her papers with the unhurried precision of someone who will begin when she is ready and not before. This is a hearing regarding Vantage Development Corporation versus the question of permit validity and residency continuance at the property located at 1247 Millhaven Road, she said. I want to note for the record that this courtroom is operating at capacity, which reflects the degree of community interest in these proceedings. I also want to note that community interest is not a legal standard and will not be treated as one. What will be treated as legal standards are the procedural requirements governing the permit approval process and the evidentiary threshold for a comprehensive review. Mr. Price, you may proceed. Price stood with the practiced smoothness of someone who regards courtrooms as professional terrain. He presented the Vantage Development position in the organized, well-documented manner of a corporate attorney who has spent months preparing for a case he expected to be straightforward. The property ownership was a matter of recorded fact. The permits had been approved by the County Planning Commission through the established process. The occupants had no legal claim to residency on property they did not own and had improved without authorization. The relocation package represented a generous accommodation of sympathetic but legally irrelevant circumstances. He was thorough and he was precise, and he was in the technical sense of the term correct about most of what he said. Reed listened to all of it with the attention he brought to things that needed to be understood before they could be addressed. And he noted the places where Price was most confident, because those were the places where Price had decided the case was settled. And settled confidence was the kind that did not account for the thing you had not anticipated. David Marsh called Bertie Alcott first. She testified with the measured precision of someone who has spent a career in public service and understands that the credibility of what she says is inseparable from the manner in which she says it. She described the permit approval process as it was designed to function, and then she described with careful specificity the ways in which the Vantage application had satisfied the technical requirements of each step while producing outcomes that deviated from the process's intended purpose. The environmental impact study was conducted during February, she said, which falls within the permissible window under county regulations. However, standard practice in environmental assessment is to conduct surveys across multiple seasons to capture the full range of biological activity at a site. A winter-only survey produces data that is not representative of the site's ecological characteristics during the period when development activity would have its primary impact, which is the spring and summer construction season. Price objected on the grounds that the study met the regulatory requirement. Judge Crane sustained the objection but allowed Bertie to complete her characterization of standard practice versus minimum compliance, which was the distinction that mattered. Bertie testified to the traffic study window, the community input session scheduling, and the legal notice methodology with the same careful precision, drawing the line between technical compliance and adequate process without overstating the legal significance of the gap. She was not arguing that Vantage had broken rules. She was testifying that the rules as applied by Vantage had produced a process that had not actually accomplished what the rules were designed to accomplish. When Price cross-examined her, he focused on the compliance record, pressing her to confirm at each point that the specific requirement had been met. She confirmed each compliance on the record because the confirmations were accurate. But the confirmations coming after her direct testimony produced an effect that Price had not fully anticipated. They documented with her own words the gap between what had been required and what had been adequate, and they did so in the precise, specific language of a public official who understood both. David Marsh called Reed next. Reed walked to the witness stand with the gait of a man who has decided where he is going and is not uncertain about the path. He sat down and looked out at the courtroom and found in the gallery the faces of his children. Lily had the journal against her chest. Finn had his notebook open on his knee. They were watching him with the specific quality of attention that children bring to the moments when their father is required to be the person they need him to be. He told his story first because David Marsh had advised him that the sequence mattered, that the human architecture of a situation established the frame within which the technical arguments were understood. He told it plainly in the direct language he used for everything, without embellishment or the kind of self-pity that he had learned to identify and distrust during the years when it would have been easiest to indulge. He told them about Mara. He told them about the tools and the house and the RV and the transmission in Millhaven Road. He told them about the signs on their cardboard and about Agnes Whitfield and her thermos, and about Walt Gruber arriving with a tool belt he had sold because he could not afford not to sell it. He told it without looking away from the courtroom, and the courtroom listened with the quality of attention that rooms produce when something true is being said in them. Then David Marsh asked him about the documents. Reed opened the manila folder on the railing in front of him. He had organized its contents that morning at 4 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table in the growing light, arranging the pages in the sequence that a foreman uses to walk a client through a set of construction plans, moving from the large to the small, from the framing to the details, from the structure to the finish. The environmental impact study was conducted on February 7th, February 14th, and February 21st, Reed said. He spoke in the direct, specific manner of someone presenting technical information to a professional audience. I've spent 15 years reading environmental studies as part of construction permit packages. A study conducted in February in Tennessee captures winter baseline data. The migratory bird populations had not returned. The amphibian breeding activity had not begun. The insect emergence that drives the food web for the spring and summer season had not occurred. The species counts in this study reflect a site in biological winter and use those counts to characterize the site's ecological value during a development process that would occur primarily in spring and summer. That is not standard methodology. That is a methodology that produces the lowest possible species counts and the lowest possible ecological significance rating. He turned to the next section of the folder. The traffic study was conducted on a Tuesday in January between 11 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. He set the traffic study beside the county school district's published bus route schedule, which he had printed from the county website. The school buses serving the elementary and middle school routes that pass the site on Millhaven Road run at 7:45 in the morning and 3:20 in the afternoon. The traffic study measured zero school bus activity because it was conducted during a window that excluded both school bus runs. A commercial development on this site would affect those roads directly. The study contains no analysis of that impact because it was conducted in a way that made that impact invisible. He turned to the community input records. The 3 community input sessions were held at 10 in the morning on weekdays in October and November. He set the session records beside a printout of the county's own demographic data for Millhaven and the surrounding area, which showed that 73% of working-age adults in the county were employed in jobs with standard Monday through Friday daytime schedules. The sessions were noticed in the legal notice section of the Millhaven Courier, which satisfies the notification requirement under county code. I've been in Millhaven for 3 months. In that time, I have met dozens of residents who have strong opinions about commercial development in this town and who had no knowledge that these sessions occurred. That is not an accident of timing. That is the outcome of a notification method chosen for its compliance rather than its effectiveness. He closed the folder. I've read construction documents for 15 years, he said. I know the difference between a document that is designed to inform a decision and a document that is designed to justify one that has already been made. These documents were designed to justify a decision that was made before the process began. Price's cross-examination was aggressive in the way that cross-examinations become aggressive when the examiner has realized that the direct testimony has landed more heavily than anticipated. He pressed Reed on his qualifications, on the absence of formal credentials in environmental science or traffic engineering, on the distinction between a layman's reading of technical documents and expert testimony. Reed answered each question with the same direct specificity he had brought to his direct testimony, acknowledging the limits of his expertise precisely, and then returning each time to the specific data points that did not require expertise to read. The February 7th survey date is printed on the cover page of the environmental study, Reed said at one point. I don't need a degree in ecology to read a calendar. The gallery did not laugh because Judge Crane's courtroom was not that kind of room. But something shifted in it, some quality of collective attention that Reed felt without being able to locate its source. When Price finished his cross-examination, Judge Crane looked at Reed for a moment with the expression of someone who is deciding whether there is a question she wants to ask from the bench. She decided. Mr. Calloway, she said, in your professional experience, when a construction document package is prepared in the manner you've described, what is the typical purpose? Reed considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. In my experience, he said, when every element of a permit package meets the minimum requirement and none of them exceed it, and when the minimum requirements happen to produce the data that is most favorable to the applicant's desired outcome, the typical purpose is to create a record of compliance rather than to conduct a genuine assessment. The goal is not to find out whether the project is appropriate. The goal is to document that the process was followed. Judge Crane made a note. She looked at the quilt on the back wall for a moment, and then she looked at Reed, and then she looked at Price, and then she said, we'll hear from the next witness. David Marsh called Lily. Price objected immediately with the practiced force of a man invoking a principle rather than expressing a concern. The child is 10 years old and cannot provide legally cognizable testimony on permit procedural standards or property law. David Marsh was prepared for this, Your Honor. This proceeding involves not only the technical question of permit validity, but the community impact of the development and the welfare of minor children who are directly affected by its outcome. The child has a right to speak to how these proceedings affect her life and her understanding of what is at stake. Judge Crane considered this for a moment that felt in the crowded courtroom considerably longer than it probably was. I'll allow limited testimony, she said. Mr. Marsh, confine your questions to the child's direct experience and understanding. Mr. Price, I'll remind you that credibility assessment is my function, not yours. Lily walked to the witness stand with Mara's locket around her neck, the oval pendant catching the light from the tall windows in the way that gold catches light, throwing it back warm and specific. She was small against the formal furniture of the witness box, small in the way that made the formality around her more rather than less significant. She sat up straight in the way that Reed recognized as the posture Mara had taught her. The posture that said, I am here, and I am paying attention, and I am not afraid of this room. She stated her name and her age and her address with the precise clarity of a child who has been told that these things matter and has decided to treat them accordingly. 1247 Millhaven Road. Millhaven, Tennessee, she said. And in the way she said it, the address was not a piece of information but a declaration. David Marsh asked her about the house. She opened the journal not because she needed it, but because she wanted it visible, and she showed Judge Crane the drawings that had preceded the construction, the rooms that had existed in colored pencil before they existed in lumber and concrete. She explained each room with the focused detail of someone who has been thinking about these spaces for a long time and wants the explanation to be exact. The morning room and the direction of its windows, the workshop and the north-facing glass, the garden beds and the specific plants she had assigned to each section. She explained what the volunteers had done and why it had mattered to her, not in terms of the physical construction, but in terms of what it had meant to be a 10-year-old who had understood with the clarity that children sometimes achieve about the things that most affect them, that her father was disappearing into his grief, and that the act of building something together had brought him back. David Marsh asked her what would happen if her family had to leave. Lily was quiet for a moment, not searching for an answer, but choosing how to give one she already had. We would have to start somewhere else, she said. But it wouldn't be the same because the people who helped us build our home live in Millhaven. Our community is part of our home. You can't move the home without moving the community, and you can't move the community. Price's cross-examination was brief. He asked her in the careful tone of a man who has been instructed by his professional training to avoid appearing to attack a child, whether she understood that her family did not own the property where their home was built. Lily looked at him with the direct attention that children bring to questions they consider straightforward. I understand that Mr. Price's company bought the land, she said, but I also understand that buying something doesn't mean you should take it away from people who need it more than you do. My mom always said that what you do with what you have matters more than what you have. Price said he had no further questions. Judge Crane looked at Lily for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, young lady. You may step down." As Lily returned to her seat in the gallery, she passed close to the plaintiff's table, and Reed watched Garrison Price watch her pass, and he saw something move across Price's face in the half-second before his professional composure reasserted itself. Something that was not quite regret and not quite recognition, but occupied the space between them. Judge Crane recessed for deliberation. The courtroom did not empty. The people who had driven from Millhaven and from the surrounding towns remained in their seats or gathered on the courthouse steps in the summer heat, talking in the low, urgent tones of people waiting for something that matters. Reed sat with his children on a bench near the window, Lily against his left side, and Finn against his right, and he looked out at the square with the stillness that is not the absence of feeling, but its saturation point. Claire sat across from him, She did not say anything optimistic or reassuring because she had read the situation accurately enough to know that optimism and reassurance were not what Reed needed from her. She sat with him in the way that someone sits with another person when sitting with them is the most useful thing they can offer. Walt and Agnes and Roscoe and the others moved in and out of Reed's peripheral vision, patient and present in the way of people who have decided that waiting together is preferable to waiting apart, and who understand that the quality of community is not diminished by uncertainty, but revealed by it. Judge Crane returned after 90 minutes. The courtroom resettled itself in the way that rooms resettle when the thing that matters is about to happen, and Judge Crane arranged her papers and looked out at the assembled community and the quilt on the back wall, and the corporate attorneys with their document binders, and Reed Calloway with his manila folder and his children in the gallery, and she began. "This case requires me to balance competing legitimate interests," she said. "Property rights represent one of the foundational principles of our legal system, and Vantage Development Corporation's ownership of this property is documented and valid. I am not in a position to set aside those rights on the basis of community sentiment, however genuine and however moving its expression." Price shifted forward slightly. Reed kept his eyes on Judge Crane. "However she continued, the permit approval process exists for reasons that are not merely procedural. The environmental impact assessment, the traffic analysis, the community input requirements, these exist because development decisions have consequences that extend beyond the immediate interests of the developer, and because those consequences are best understood through processes that are genuinely designed to surface them, not processes that are technically compliant while functionally designed to minimize scrutiny." She paused. "The evidence presented today raises substantive questions about whether the Vantage Development Permit process, while technically compliant at each individual step, achieved the cumulative purpose that the process is designed to achieve. These are not questions I can resolve from the bench today on the basis of the evidence before me. They are questions that require a comprehensive review by the appropriate regulatory body." She looked at Price. "I am ordering a comprehensive review of the Vantage Development Corporation permit approval to be conducted by the County Planning Commission with full public participation procedures. This review will be completed within 90 days. During the review period, the current occupants of the property may remain in place without penalty or further legal action by the property owner. Any party wishing to submit a competing proposal for the property's use, including purchase offers, may do so within the review period for consideration alongside Vantage's development application." Price was on his feet. "Your Honor, this ruling effectively suspends legally obtained property rights without a finding of wrongdoing. This ruling requires that legally obtained development permits be validated through a process that is adequate rather than merely compliant." Judge Crane replied, "Your client's property rights remain intact. Their exercise is subject to the completion of the required process." She gathered her papers. "I will also note for the record," she said without looking up, "that the testimony presented today regarding the specific procedural deficiencies in the permit application was among the most technically precise and clearly organized lay testimony I have encountered in 22 years on this bench." She paused. "Mr. Calloway, you are clearly a man who knows how to read a document." She left the bench. The courtroom broke apart when something has been decided, and the energy held in the waiting of it releases all at once. Agnes Whitfield made a sound that was not quite a word. Walt Gruber put his hand briefly on Reed's shoulder and took it away. Roscoe Tanner said something that Reed did not catch. Connor was already on his phone, thumbs moving, broadcasting the outcome to whatever network he had assembled over the course of the campaign. Lily put her arms around Reed's waist and pressed her face against his side, and he put his arm around her and held her with the force of a man who has spent 3 years learning to hold on to what he has. 90 days, Finn said, standing at Reed's other side with his notebook open. He was already writing. That's enough time. For what Reed asked. For everything Finn said with the complete confidence of someone who has already run the calculation. Reed looked across the emptying courtroom at Garrison Price, who was gathering documents with the controlled efficiency of a man who has lost a round, but has not lost his capacity to continue. Price met his eyes briefly, and Reed held the look without hostility and without satisfaction, with the simple directness of a man who has done what he came to do and has no need to add to it. Then he turned away and walked with his children toward the courthouse doors, and the summer afternoon beyond them, and the next 90 days began. He started on the evidence package that night. It was not something he had discussed with David Marsh, though he intended to inform him before sending anything. It was something he had decided during the 90 minutes of Judge Crane's deliberation, sitting on the bench near the window with his children against his sides, in the square of Hardin County laid out in the heat outside. He had decided it the way he decided most things, not as a single moment of resolution, but as the arrival at the surface of a process that had been running below it for some time. The decision was this: a comprehensive permit review was a process with an uncertain outcome, and uncertain outcomes required additional pressure from additional directions. And Reed Calloway was a man who had spent his career understanding that a building's integrity depended not on any single element, but on the redundancy of its systems, the way that multiple independent load paths meant that the failure of one did not produce the failure of the structure. He organized the evidence package over 4 nights working at the kitchen table after the twins were asleep, building a document that told the story of the Vantage permit process in the specific sequential documented manner of someone who understands that an argument is only as strong as the evidence that supports it. He used the construction documents format he had developed over 15 years, the format that moved from the large to the small, from the framing to the details, from the pattern to its components. He sent it to 3 places. The first was the Millhaven Courier, addressed to the editor with a cover letter that explained what the document showed and why a community newspaper's readers had a legitimate interest in understanding it. He had met the editor twice during the project, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Vance, who had covered the story from its beginning with the combination of local knowledge and journalistic instinct that produces reporting that is simultaneously accurate and human. He trusted her to read the documents and understand what she was reading. The second was the Tennessee State Attorney General's Office Division of Consumer Protection and Public Integrity. He had looked up the relevant division on the county library's computer the morning after the hearing and had found the specific filing procedures for complaints regarding fraudulent or deceptive permit application processes. He filed according to those procedures, attaching the evidence package as required and citing the relevant statutes that David Marsh had identified during their case preparation. The third was the Office of the State Inspector General for County Planning and Development, which was a body Reed had not known existed 3 months ago and had learned about from Bertie Alcott in a conversation that had lasted 45 minutes and had the quality on Bertie's side of someone providing information in the most accurate manner possible without explicitly recommending an action. He did not tell anyone he had sent the packages until they were sent. He told Claire the following morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, while the twins were at the summer reading program that Agnes had organized through the Millhaven Library. Claire listened to him describe what he had done with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to things that mattered. "You did this yourself," she said, "not through the lawyers." With David Marsh's knowledge, Reed said, "he reviewed the statutory citations before I filed." But yes, Claire was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with the expression she had that meant she was seeing something she had suspected for some time and was now certain of. "You know what you are," she said. He looked at her. "You're a builder," she said, "not just of structures. You figure out what the foundation needs and you build it, and then you build everything else on top of it. You did it with the house and you did it with the court case, and you're doing it now." Reed considered this. He had never thought of himself in these terms as a builder of things beyond the physical, though he recognized hearing it that it was accurate in a way that the more obvious description of his skills had never quite been. "Mar used to say something like that," he said. "Tell me." She said that the reason I was good at my job was that I never confused the thing I was building with the reason I was building it. She said most people lose track of the reason and end up building something that's technically correct and fundamentally wrong. Claire looked at him for a moment. She said, "What you built here is neither of those things." The 90 days moved with the quality of time that is both too slow and too fast slow in the daily progression of regulatory proceedings and crowdfunding updates and permit review hearings, fast in the accumulation of changes that were visible only in retrospect. The crowdfunding campaign passed $200,000 in the sixth week, driven by a cascade of sharing that Connor tracked with the focused attention of someone watching a scientific phenomenon unfold in real time. By the eighth week, it had passed 400,000. By the end of the 10th week, it stood at $527,000, donated by people in all 50 states and 14 countries, most of whom had encountered the story through a network of sharing that had its own momentum, the way water finds its own level. The state attorney general's office opened a formal inquiry in the fourth week. The notice arrived by certified mail addressed to Vantage Development Corporation and copied to the County Planning Commission and to Reed Callaway as the complainant, and it had the bureaucratic weight of official documents that mean what they say. Reed read it twice and filed it in the manila folder and did not celebrate because he had learned during the years of managing Mara's illness that the opening of a process was not the same as its resolution. But it was something. It was the second load path. The State Inspector General's office opened its own inquiry in the sixth week. This notice was copied to 3 additional parties that had not been on the Attorney General's notice, including 2 of the county planning commissioners who had approved the Vantage permit, which told Reed, who read documents carefully, that the Inspector General's inquiry had a somewhat different scope than the Attorney General's. Connor found the investor news in the 7th week through a financial news aggregator he had set up specifically to track Vantage Development Corporation's public filings and press releases. 3 institutional investors had withdrawn from the Millhaven Commercial Development Project, citing what their withdrawal statements described as unacceptable reputational risk associated with the ongoing regulatory scrutiny of the permit approval process. The withdrawals represented, Connor calculated, approximately 60% of the project's committed capital. He showed Reed the printouts at the kitchen table one morning with the restrained excitement of someone who knows that good news is not the same as final news, but is still good news. Reed read the withdrawal statements. He thought about Garrison Price in his charcoal suit standing in the lot with the manila envelope and the practiced warmth and the careful management of a situation he had believed was already decided. He thought about the black SUV with the Nashville plate sitting at the end of the road in the early mornings, watching what was being built. He thought that some things once built in public could not be quietly demolished. The news about Price came from Patricia Vance at the Millhaven Courier, who called Reed on a Thursday morning in the 9th week and told him with the measured precision of a journalist who separates what she knows from what she is inferring that Garrison Price had been placed on administrative leave by his firm pending an internal review of his conduct in connection with the Millhaven permit application, and that the state attorney general's inquiry had expanded to include a formal investigation of potential fraud in the permit approval process, with Price named as a subject of the investigation. Reed thanked her and ended the call and stood in the morning room for a moment in the gold light that came through the east-facing windows exactly as Lily had drawn it 100 times before it existed. And he felt not triumph, which was the emotion the situation seemed to be designed to produce, but something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a man who identified a flaw in a foundation, reported it accurately, and watched the structure fail the way structures fail when their foundations are not sound. Vantage Development Corporation announced the cancellation of the Millhaven Commercial Development Project in the 10th week. The announcement cited regulatory uncertainty and changed market conditions, which were the terms that corporations use when the actual reasons are not suitable for press releases. They listed the property for sale at a price that was, Connor noted after 30 minutes of comparative analysis, 14% below the assessed value, which was the price of needing to sell something quickly rather than well. The Wildflower Lane Community Housing Trust made an offer the following Monday. The crowdfunding total of $527,000, combined with a matching grant of $140,000 from a state affordable housing initiative that Bertie Alcott had identified and helped them secure through the county's housing development office, gave the trust a purchase capacity of $667,000, enough to meet Vantage's reduced asking price and retain a reserve for the trust's operating costs. The offer was accepted within 48 hours. 1,247 Millhaven Road was transferred to the Wildflower Lane Community Housing Trust on a Wednesday afternoon in September at a closing that took place in a conference room at the Hardin County Courthouse, with Bertie Alcott and David Marsh and Agnes Whitfield and Walt Gruber, and a notary public who had been briefed on the situation and who signed the documents with the visible satisfaction of someone who has occasionally been asked to notarize things worth notarizing. Reed held the deed for a moment after the notary handed it across the table. It was a piece of paper 11 inches by 8.5, printed on the official stock of the Hardin County Register of Deeds, describing in the dense, specific language of property law a parcel of land at the intersection of Millhaven Road and Sycamore Branch Way, Millhaven, Tennessee. He thought of the first morning. The pale blue Buick pulled off the road, and the silver-haired woman with the thermos and his daughter walking across the gravel in her bare feet, holding out her hand. He handed the deed to Agnes, who would serve as the trust's first board chair, and Agnes took it with both hands. Over the course of the summer, Reed had become, without either of them naming it, the adult Connor measured things against. Not a replacement for what he had lost, but a different thing, the kind of mentor who teaches by doing rather than by telling, which was the only kind Connor's particular intelligence could fully receive. They had worked side by side for months, and in that working Reed had passed along not just construction knowledge, but something harder to name, the understanding that competence and care were not separate qualities, but expressions of the same underlying thing. So when Connor was accepted the previous week to the architectural program he had applied to with a scholarship that cited his project documentation from Millhaven as evidence of the kind of thinking the program was designed to develop, he had told Reed before he told anyone else. Reed had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Your mother must be proud." And Connor had said, "She is." And then after a pause, "You know she's going to take credit for this." And Reed had said, "She should." And they had stood there for a moment in the companionship that does not require more than it has. The wedding was Walt Gruber's idea. He raised it characteristically without preamble on a Saturday morning in late September, while he and Reed were finishing the trim work on the morning room windows. Walt had been approaching a subject indirectly for 2 weeks, circling it, in the way that men who are not comfortable with sentiment approach the things that require it, and Reed had recognized the circling and waited for it to complete itself. "You know what that house needs," Walt said, running his hand along a piece of window casing to check for level. Reed waited. "A proper occasion," Walt said. "A real one. Not a construction milestone. A life milestone." Reed looked at the window casing. "Claire," Walt said in the tone of a man who has said everything necessary in a single word. Reed did not answer immediately. He had been aware of this territory for some time, the way you are aware of a shift in a building's behavior before you can identify the specific cause, a settling or a movement that registers before the conscious mind is caught up. He had been in this territory before. He knew its landmarks. He also knew that the second time you enter a territory, you carry the map of the first time with you, and that this was not a deficiency but a form of preparation. "I know," he said after a moment. Walt nodded, which was his version of saying everything that remained to be said. Reed asked Claire that evening. They were sitting on the deck after the twins were asleep in the hour that had become, without being named or designated, the hour when the day's work was set aside, and what remained was the quieter business of being two people who had built something together that neither had expected to build. The Tennessee evening was warm and full of the insects that would thin and then disappear as October came on, and the solar panels on the roof were conducting their silent conversion of the day's stored light into the energy that powered the lamps inside. He did not prepare a speech. He had never been a man who prepared speeches, and Claire was not a woman who would have wanted one. He told her what he thought, which was that he had not expected to find someone who could sit with him inside the life he had, which was a life still shaped by Mara's absence, and make it feel like something worth building forward from rather than backward toward. He told her that Lily and Finn had decided months ago in the way that children decide things without announcement or consultation, and that he trusted their judgment in this as in most things. He told her that he loved her in the simple, declarative manner of a man who means what he says and says what he means, because those were the only registers he had ever been comfortable in. Claire was quiet for a moment after he finished. She was looking out at the dark hills above Millhaven, the same hills that had been there when a rusted RV had coasted to a stop at the edge of an abandoned lot in March. "Yes," she said, and then with the slight smile that Reed had come to understand contained more than it appeared to. "Obviously, yes. I've been waiting for you to catch up." The wedding was in the rooftop garden on a Saturday in October, when the Tennessee hills had completed their turn and the maples were the impossible colors that made people who had grown up among them still stop and look. The garden that Lily had designed in colored pencil across dozens of journal pages had become, over the course of the summer, the thing she had designed, because Lily's designs had a quality of inevitability that the physical world generally accommodated when given sufficient time and sufficient hands to work with. The community gathered without requiring an elaborate mechanism of invitation, because word in Millhaven moved the way it had always moved, person to person, each telling the next, each understanding that this was the kind of thing you showed up for. Agnes and Walt and Roscoe and Bertie and Connor and the volunteers and the neighbors and the people from the surrounding towns who had driven past the signs and stopped and stayed. They were all there, arranged among the garden beds. In the October light, the whole accumulated weight of the thing they had built together, present in the form of the people who had built it. Walt gave Reed the key before the ceremony, pressing it into his hand with the gravity of a man performing a ritual he has taken seriously. It was carved from oak, the wood dark and smooth, worked with the patient precision that Walt brought to all his best pieces. The shaft was carved with the small flowers that Lily used to decorate everything she wrote. The bow was etched with the geometric pattern of the solar panels on the roof. The numbers 1247 were inscribed in letters that matched exactly the lettering from Lily's first roadside sign, because Walt had studied that sign long enough to learn its hand. "Every home needs a proper key," Walt said, which was what he had prepared, and it was enough. The ceremony was brief and exact. Pastor Elmore spoke about building because it was the language that made sense in this context, because it was the language everyone present shared. He spoke about the difference between structures that are designed to last and structures that are designed to appear to last, and about how the difference is not always visible from the outside, but is always visible from within. He said that what had been built on this lot in Millhaven was both kinds of thing, the physical and the other, and that the wedding they were witnessing was the completion of the foundation that had been poured in March, when a man's children had planted 3 signs in the gravel of an unknown place and waited to see what would come. Reed and Claire exchanged vows in the plain specific language of two people who have already demonstrated through the preceding months what their commitments mean in practice rather than in declaration. The twins stood beside them, Lily with Claire's flowers, and Finn with the rings, both of them carrying the occasion with the serious dignity of children who understand that some moments require their best selves. Finn was not holding his notebook for once. Reed could see the outline of it in his jacket pocket, the familiar rectangular shape. But Finn had decided that the occasion permitted carrying it without opening it, which was as close to leaving it at home as Finn Calloway had ever gotten. And Reed found this more moving than he expected. Agnes read something. Roscoe made a sound that he covered with a cough. Walt did not make any sound at all, which was his version of being moved. The reception was food from Mara's recipe box prepared by Claire and Connor and Agnes, and the volunteers who had offered a table that stretched the length of the deck and held every dish that had been marked in Mara's handwriting with the notation "good for gatherings." The cooking had been a project of the previous 3 days, the kitchen warm with the accumulated smell of the meals that Mara had prepared for the people she loved present, now in a form that honored the past without being confined to it. Connor gave a toast that began with the sustainable architecture data points and pivoted after a single sentence to something entirely different. Something about what it meant to watch a family build a home and to understand from the experience of having helped that the building was never really about the structure. He was 16 years old, and he said it without embarrassment because he had been shaped by months in the company of people who did not treat the truth of a feeling as less serious than the truth of a calculation. The October light came down through the maple leaves above the garden in the shifting patterns of late afternoon gold and amber, and the occasional sharp red that seemed to have no intermediate between green and itself. Lily sat beside Reed during a quiet moment, between toasts, her head against his arm. The journal closed on her lap for once, not because there was nothing to draw, but because she was content for the moment to simply be in the thing rather than record it. "Daddy," she said. He looked down at her. "I think we built the right thing." He put his arm around her. "I think we did," he said. The first class was scheduled for November. Reed had spent October developing the curriculum, working at the kitchen table in the evenings, with the same methodical attention he brought to construction plans, building a sequence of lessons that moved from foundation work to framing, to finish teaching the skills in the order that they built upon each other, because the logic of construction was also a logic of learning. Connor had enrolled as the first student, which meant the first class would begin with a 16-year-old future architect asking questions that Reed would need to think carefully about to answer well, which was exactly the kind of beginning he would have chosen. The class would be held in the workshop in the North Light with the tools that filled the bench along the south wall, some of them Walt's and some of them Roscoe's, and some of them his own, recovered from the shelf of a second-hand shop by a man who had recognized initials stamped into leather and understood what they meant to the man they belonged to. When the last of the guests had gone and the twins were asleep and the garden was quiet in the autumn dark, Reed stood alone on the deck for a moment. He stood the way he had stood on 100 job sites at the end of the day, with the stillness that comes to craftsmen when the work is done and the work is good. He went inside. Mara's ring was in its frame on the mantelpiece, the simple gold band set in a small shadow box that Lily had decorated with pressed flowers from the garden chicory, blue and black-eyed Susan yellow, the colors of the lot as it had been when they arrived. The photograph beside it was the one from Lily's locket, the twins as infants, their faces barely visible in the miniature frame, a whole life contained in a square inch of silver. He looked at it for a moment. He thought about what Mara had known at the end, not with certainty, but with something stronger than certainty because it was rooted in love rather than evidence. She had known that he would find his way back. She had made him promise to take care of their babies, understanding that the promise would require him to take care of himself, and that taking care of himself would require him to find again the man who knew how to build things, who knew how to read a document and find its weakness, who knew how to stand in front of a room full of people and tell them the truth. He had found that man. He had found him in the weight of a tool belt across his hips on a morning in March. He had found him in the foundation footings curing in the dark. He had found him in a manila folder, in a 4-page letter, and the specific sequential documented evidence of a wrong that needed to be named. He turned off the lamp. He walked through the morning room where the east windows would bring the gold light in a few hours, and down the hall that Lily had designed for its proportions and Finn had engineered for its load paths, and into the room where Claire was already asleep, one hand open on the pillow in the unconscious generosity of someone who makes room for others, even in sleep. He lay down beside her in the dark. Outside, the solar panels on the roof continued their quiet work, converting the stored energy of the day's light into the power that ran the lamps and the refrigerator and the workshop tools and everything else that made a house a place where living was possible. The garden was dark and dormant. In the October night, the beds prepared for winter, the seeds for spring already purchased and labeled in Lily's handwriting and stored in the cabinet above the workbench. The road at the edge of the lot was empty in both directions. The rusted for sale sign that had leaned at a dejected angle on the day they arrived was gone. Remove the week the trust had taken ownership, replaced by nothing, because the lot did not need a sign anymore. It had a house and a garden and a workshop and a family and a community that had decided, each member independently and then collectively, that this was a place worth fighting for. The sign that hung in the morning room in its frame on the wall was the original. The first one, the cardboard from a cereal box painted in a 10-year-old's careful cursive and decorated with flowers and a heart in the blue that Mara had always called impossible. It had faded over the months, the colors softened, and the edges worn, but the words were still legible to anyone who came close enough to read them. Help us build a home. Below it, in the same impossible blue but in a different hand, smaller and more recent, painted directly onto the wall beneath the frame, were four words that had begun as a caption in a journal and had become, over the course of a year, that none of them had been able to predict or plan for the truest description of what they had actually built. Home is where love lives. Reed Calloway lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around him and breathe the air of a place that was his, not because a deed said so, though a deed said so, but because he had built it with his hands and his children's hope and the extraordinary grace of people who had chosen without obligation to stop. He thought of nothing in particular. He held no ring in his palm because the ring was in its frame on the mantelpiece, and he was here, and that was the whole of it. He closed his eyes, he slept.